All right, apologize everybody for the little snafu at the beginning there. Vince Michelanis with the San Diego Regional Urban Forest Council, welcoming you to our October 6th general meeting and presentation. Today's presenter is Dr. Igor Lacan with UC Cooperative Extension. Igor will discuss how trees respond to drought and how we can best help them along while recognizing there's intense competition for what water we do have. We'll discuss what weather patterns we're seeing now, what we can expect for the future, and what does this mean for the trees we have now and where we will be going. So Igor, I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Vince. Thank you all for having me. So Igor Lacan, Cooperative Extension, thank you very much for coming. I see some names I know, and I hope to meet you all sometime in person in the future. If you have questions as we go through, please put them in the chat, and then somebody, maybe Vince, can be the question wrangler. If there's something that makes it clear that I'm not getting things across, then just interrupt me and I'll stop. But otherwise, I will leave some time for questions at the end. But don't be shy. When you have to think of a question, just put it in the chat so you don't forget it, and we'll get to them at the end. So we're going to talk about trees and drought, and specifically, I want to talk about how trees recover from drought, because I think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, and it gives us some clue about what we might do to help them along. So this is the overview. We'll talk about what trees do with water, and then what happens inside the tree when there isn't enough water. We'll talk a little bit about the recent droughts and our new climate. And I think there's a couple of interesting new bits of research that have come out that I don't think are going to be surprising to anybody, but it's interesting to see that some of the things we're seeing in the field are actually now being reflected in the research papers as well. And then I'll just briefly talk about sources of water. This is going to be a review for most of you, but I think it's useful perhaps when you're talking to your clients about what they will be needing to do in the future. So this is just the editorial front end, which is that trees need water, and this is something that a lot of our clients and our municipalities forget. In other words, providing trees with some little fraction of the water they have transpired is different from providing them with no water, and somehow that gets lost. Water is integral to those tree benefits, and we know the benefits are huge. And on our side, on the arborist side, we just need to remember there's some very different watering strategies we're using for newly planted trees and for the mature trees. And using strategies for mature trees and newly planted trees is pretty much a recipe for disaster. And so just keep that in mind. And by the way, I sent my slides to Vince. There's about 30 slides in there that specifically focus on the watering techniques and all that. So if you're interested, Vince is free to share all my slides with anybody who's interested. I will not be covering that in this presentation, but we do have quite a bit of information on how to provide water to trees. What I want to talk about is how trees recover from droughts. And the thing to remember is that trees have evolved with periodic droughts. So any tree anywhere in the world will experience a drought in its lifetime. Trees live a long time. So by definition, if it's a tree, it's evolved to cope with periodic droughts. And again, important to remember when people say, well, we should not have trees or we should cut down trees. Well, that's not actually what's happening. The other thing to remember that when we talk about trees being resilient, there's really two elements to this. One is their ability to resist damage from drought, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the second is their ability to recover from drought. We'll talk about that as well. And of course, trees adapt and species adapt over geologic time to recover better. Can we predict this? No, not very well, not yet, sorry. And the final kind of note, and we'll talk about that as well, is that heat makes all of this much worse. It makes recovery more difficult, and it makes the stress more intense. So we'll talk about heat a little bit. And so as far as the climate goes, the thing to remember is that a drought-ier climate is what we're going to be expecting. But our expectations and our trees that we see in the world today are based on our old climate. So we will need to adapt it. That's not a bad thing. But by definition, what had worked in the past may not work in the future. And that's simply the reality of it. And the final thing is we do need to talk about water, how we use water, what we use water for, in the sense of what kind of a living environment do we want to create? And I think that the kind of short answer is that it's probably not the environment that was present before 1770, before we built all of our cities, before we had 40 million people living in the state. So what we're going to have, the urban environments of the future are not going to really look like the natural environments of the past. And that's okay. And then the final question, we'll talk about this in the end, is do you have new water that's available? And by new water, I really mean locally available water. The era of massive water importation is not over, but the era of looking elsewhere for water is probably over. So when we're talking about new water, that really has to be local sources of new water. So let's talk about what trees do with water. And it's very simple. Plants need water for a few basic reasons. One is they hold themselves up with water. That's called turgor. It's the pressure that water in the cells exerts against the cell membrane and then against the cell walls. And in non-woody plants, that's what holds the plants up. So one of the immediate signs of water stress is that plants wilt. And as you know, that is fully reversible. We often see this in the late afternoon because, especially in our climates, plants, even when they're fully watered, are not necessarily able to move water quickly enough to maintain this full turgor. But they do recover overnight. And this is one of the very basic tools that you can use to assess how well your landscape is doing. If you're seeing water stress in the late afternoon, but in the morning everything looks fine, then your plants may have enough water, and it's simply a matter of that very intense demand. And I mentioned heat makes this much worse, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing water does for a tree is that it moves solutes around. It moves around products of photosynthesis, which are the sugars, which are moved from the leaves into the trunk and into the roots. And it also moves minerals from the roots into the trunk and into the leaves. Very importantly, water is also used in the process of photosynthesis. Water actually participates in that chemical reaction, and separately, the two things occur together, but they're actually sort of separate mechanical processes. Water is lost from the tree during photosynthesis. And here's just a reminder of how this works. This is a leaf that's been flipped upside down. Most of our leaves have these stomatal pores on the underside of the leaf. And these are specifically made cells that are able to open or close. These are called the guard cells. And they're able to open or close to allow water to transpire out and to allow carbon dioxide to enter into the leaf. And so, two things to remember here. If you have a lot of water stress, these guard cells will close, which is good, maybe, in that it prevents water loss, but it's bad in that it also prevents carbon dioxide from entering, and it essentially stops the process of carbon sequestration, stops photosynthesis. The other thing to remember is that water actually goes into this little equation of photosynthesis. And remember that what you get out is sugar and oxygen. We appreciate the oxygen, and the plant then uses this sugar to do everything else. So when people talk about plant food, that's not quite the way it works. Plants feed themselves by converting carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight into sugar. And they use that sugar to make everything else, including all of those defensive compounds they need to defend themselves against insects, diseases, and so on. So what happens when there isn't enough water? Well, there are two ways that plants can die from drought. There is a quick way and a slow way. The quick way is what's called an embolism, which is when that water column that is moving up the tree gets broken. And it can get broken when you have excessive tension on it because there's so much water being transpired and not enough water is entering the roots. When that happens, when you break that water column, the water transport in that vessel stops. And so plants do their best to prevent this from happening, because once you have an embolized vessel, it takes a lot of effort for the plant to actually re-establish water conduction in that vessel. And I'm showing you here how the conifers do it. And you can see they have these pits through which water has to move. So it's not just a straight straw inside the tree. It's actually a set of cells that are connected with these bordered pits. And inside each pit is this little gong, this little membrane. And if you remove water from one side of the membrane, in this case, water's been lost from this side, something happened, embolism, the little gong swings over and blocks the pit and prevents that embolism, prevents that air bubble from spreading. Broadleaf trees have a different mechanism. They have tyloses, which act essentially like airbags, and they will actively block a vessel to, again, prevent that embolism, prevent that air bubble from spreading. Because once you've embolized enough water vessels, the plant is just not able to recover and it will die. So this was a study where they looked at a whole bunch of other studies. I love those. And they found that once you exceed about 60% of all of the vessels embolized, things start to look pretty grim. Now there's a slow way to that. I mentioned if those guard cells close, that's good for you because you're now preventing those embolisms from forming. You no longer have that giant tension on the water column, but you have now stopped the absorption of CO2 and you stop the production of sugar. And if you stop that long enough, the plant eventually, pretty quickly, runs out of food. It runs out of the way to produce new tissues. And so here's my favorite picture, which you've seen undoubtedly, because I think I show it in every presentation I give. Can you tell which year was the bad year for this tree? Well, it's not the current year. That looks pretty good. And it wasn't 2 years ago. That looks pretty good. But the previous year, last year, that looks pretty bad. And the same thing happens with broadleaf trees. It's easier to see on conifers because they keep their leaves year after year. But you can see how in a drought year, the tree is simply not able to produce as much sugar. It's simply not able to produce the tissues it needs. And if this keeps up, what you end up with is depleted energy reserves. And this is one model that I think I've shown you before, which consists of, this is the energy reserves, this black line. The gray is actually the cost to repair the tissue. And this is kind of an interesting idea. As the drought progresses, the tree still has all the costs, right? It still has to repair its tissues, but it actually has more costs because it keeps losing tissue. So at some point, the stored energy essentially just runs out and the tree dies. And this is the recap of that. You can impress your friends with these big words. In essence, here on the horizontal axis, you have the duration of the drought. On the vertical axis, you have the intensity of the drought. So if you have really high intensity of the drought, if you just have a horribly, for example, hot drought, you are going to end up with those embolisms and you will end up with a failure of the water conducting system, or as they say here, hydraulic and symplastic failure. Whereas if you have a long, maybe not so severe drought that takes forever, eventually you're just going to run out of energy. So what do trees do to recover from this? And what is it that we see in trees as they're recovering? This is a model by Sabine Ruhr and colleagues. Now, don't panic. I know there's a bunch of lines here. There are only 3 things that are being shown here. I really like this model because I think it matches up, and you can tell me in the comments if you think this is bunk, but I think it matches up with what we see. So here is the 3 things this is showing you. It's showing the stored energy reserves, which is this gray line. Remember, we talked about how important it is for the tree to continue to produce sugar. And that's basically what this is. This is sugar, the gray line up here. And you want to keep it at about 100%. And then there are 2 systems that have to recover. One is the water conducting system, and that is shown in blue. Blue like water. Okay. So basically, this is showing you the defects in water conducting system. You want to keep the defects at 0. And you get the water conducting system, which is this solid line water distribution system. Just think of them as water systems. You want to keep the problems in the water system at 0. And then the other system that has to recover is the photosynthetic system. Because remember, you have to move the water into the leaf. And then in that leaf, you have to do the photosynthesis. So 2 kind of separate but connected systems. And really here, what you have is you have the guard cells, remember that, in green. So the control of gas exchange. And then you have the photosystem 2, which is the actual thing in the chloroplast where photosynthesis happens, and that's the dashed line. So when you have really light drought, this might be something you experience every day, right? The kind of thing I described where it just can't keep up with the water. Well, essentially you are stressing that gas exchange system. The stomates close. It's maybe 5 in the afternoon and the plant says, nope, we can't keep up with the water conduction. Boop, stomates are closed. But what happens? Water system recovers right away and the stomates reopen and everything's copacetic. You didn't really lose any sugar at all. Okay, so now let's step into a more severe situation where you have a serious drought. So, and you can see this right away that you are going to be losing some of your sugars. You're going to have to invest some of your sugars because what's happening is your water conduction is really failing. And you're beginning to have some embolisms. The plant will have to invest energy to repair those. At the same time, the guard cells have closed. Guard cells said, no, this is bad. We're not getting nearly enough water. Close up. And at that point, the photosynthetic machine begins to shut down because it doesn't have CO2 and it doesn't have water. And so now, let's say things improve. So this is the damage part. Things improve. Well, the plant now has to recover the guard cells. Okay, they recover pretty well, but they only recover once your water systems begin to recover. So you're not really going to see recovery until you've provided some water. And even then, the plant now has to invest sugar, and you can see that right here, this gray line, it's investing the sugars that it stored to fix up its plumbing. Okay. Now, when we go into the severe drought, multi-year drought, hot drought, and I'll talk about heat more, then things really go sideways. Because what you're seeing is that you don't get the recovery. You see where these green lines end up? This is your photosynthetic machine. It never gets back to 100%. And your hydraulic system also never gets back down to no defect because we've now damaged enough of those water conducting vessels that what the plant now has to do, it has to build new vessels. It's incapable of repairing all of the damaged ones. It has to build new ones. Well, that's easier said than done because remember, to build something as a plant, you need sugar from the photosynthesis. And you know what's not working? Your photosynthetic system is not working as well as it used to because it's not getting the water it needs. So in a prolonged severe drought, the plant is essentially spending down its energy reserves to build up the new hydraulic system and to build up the new photosynthetic system. That's why recovery from long droughts takes so long. The plant's just not able to flip over and reuse all of its damaged parts. It has to build new ones. What happens if we have heat? Well, if we have heat, a couple of things happen that are independent and are both bad. The first thing that happens is the increased demand for water. And this is expressed in something that's called vapor pressure deficit, or VPD, vapor pressure deficit. That is essentially the power with which the water is sucked out of a plant. And what's weird about this is we don't feel it. We feel relative humidity, but what feels like relative humidity to us is what matters to plants is the vapor pressure deficit. And with the same relative humidity, you end up with much higher vapor pressure deficit when you increase the temperature. Do you see that? You see how the vapor pressure deficit triples, which is basically the power with which the water is being sucked out of a plant is tripled when you go from 60 Fahrenheit to 90 Fahrenheit, keeping the same relative humidity. And by the way, nursery growers, people who work with greenhouses, they're very, very attuned to this. They're very attuned to this, and they will manage vapor pressure deficit. They'll manage it by increasing relative humidity. So when you go into a greenhouse that's very warm, it's like 80 degrees, it's really, really humid. There's a reason for that, because the grower knows they must have it that humid or else their plants are going to be stressed. The second thing that happens with heat, so this is the demand side for heat, okay? You increase water demand. Everything else the same. By the way, think about what that means for climate change. When people say, oh, I'm not sure how this is going to work out, you're going to increase water demand for plants just by increasing the temperature. But at the same time, and this is the second part, heat increases evaporation from the soil, right? So this is the soil. You make things warmer, water evaporates more readily, which means there's going to be less soil moisture. So the heat has two effects. One is it increases demand, and the other one is it reduces the supply of water. So bad on both ends. And then just to make things really ugly, if you get very, very hot days, if you actually heat the tissues, plant tissues above about 105, 100 to 110 Fahrenheit, and by the way, plants try really hard not to allow that. But if the tissues really heat up, what ends up happening is the proteins in the leaf begin to break down, which means that you are now losing your photosynthetic machine. And this is really bad because remember, for this recovery to take place, even if it's a delayed recovery, you must keeps getting broken. That means that your recovery is going to be very long if it happens at all. So heat is bad, and then high heat, extreme heat is really bad. So, okay, well, that was kind of bad news all over. Are there any good news? Not quite, but there's a few things we can do. One question is, can we predict recovery? Well, basically not all that well. It varies by a whole bunch of intrinsic factors, but it also varies with the conditions. In other words, we talked about the difference between having a kind of short drought versus long drought, having a cool drought versus a hot drought. And it varies a lot with irrigation, with the post-drought conditions. Are you providing water so the tree can begin to rebuild its photosynthetic systems? The thing I want to talk a little bit about are indications of recovery, because again, I think that's potentially useful to practitioners. What the scientists talk about when they talk about recovery from drought, they talk about this recovery of gas exchange, recovery of sap flow, recovery of those stored energy levels. These can all be measured. I don't think we care about that as practitioners. I think we care about recovery of the foliage, recovery of the growth, recovery of the tree condition. The thing about all those is that those will follow the recovery of these physiological processes. And there's going to be a lag time. And the lag time is measured in months or years rather than in hours or days or weeks. So again, this is what we want. This is what actually happens first. So the bottom line for this is give them some time. Make sure you provide water, but also don't expect instant recovery. There is this question, kind of an academic question, is it bad when trees recover slowly? And the answer, I think, is no. In the sense that some trees that are adapted to drought take their time. They don't have the ability to quickly build new tissue, because they have invested in the ability to resist the damage. So this is the thing about what is resilience. Resilience is the ability to resist something plus the ability to recover. And as evolutionarily, you might invest in one or the other. And so being slow to recover doesn't mean you're necessarily badly adapted to something. It just means that might be your adaptation strategy. And just a question for everybody, is there something you are monitoring? What is it that you're looking at? Is it the leaf condition? Is it the growth increment? Is it the DBH increase? How do you tell what your trees are doing? Just kind of keep that out there. So this is a study we're doing at the moment, so I'm not going to spend any time on it, but just an example, when you start tracking that recovery from drought, you see that there's actually a bunch of patterns. So not all trees are going to exhibit the same pattern. And we're still at the very beginning of trying to figure out which tree exhibits which pattern of recovery. So my sort of message is don't rush to remove trees, just keep an eye and see if you can see any evidence of recovery. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about the climate and the water situation, because I think this is where some of the recent interesting research has come up. And when you look at some of the review papers for the so-called last drought, which was from 2012 to 2016 in Northern California, you see there were some really unusual situations. It was unusually warm and dry. It had unusually high soil temperatures, which basically caused all the moisture, soil moisture, to evaporate. And then also caused the snowpack to diminish. So when you put all those together, we ended up with really low water availability. And on the other hand, the reduction in regional precipitation seems to be happening more often. So whereas the actual drought was unusually warm and dry, there are sort of micro droughts that we're experiencing on a much higher frequency than we used to. And the key thing here is this idea of we used to. And I'll show you a map. When you think of what used to happen, what's your reference period? And it could be, and I think it is at this point, it just so happens that some of our reference periods, especially in the mid 20th century, were a little warmer and a little wetter than even the long-term average. And that's without climate change. So just keep in mind, well, this didn't used to happen. Well, what are you comparing it to? The one thing I want to kind of point you at, because this is a remarkable thing, this is Noah Diffenbaugh and colleagues in 2015 said, basically they said that what's going to happen in the future is that every time we have a drought, it's going to be a hot drought. And they use this phrase 100% probability. I don't think I've ever seen in a scientific paper somebody use the phrase 100% probability. So this is what's happening with global warming. So we've had droughts before, we're going to have droughts again. But thanks to global warming, every time we have a drought from now on, it's going to be a hot drought. And there's some evidence for this now from the actual measurements. These are not models, these are actual measurements. This is Becky Bollinger, I think it's from NOAA and Colorado State. And what they asked was, well, okay, is it warmer now than it used to be? And again, think of that compared to what? And what they did is they looked at the normal climate normals, which are the averages. And the previous average was calculated for the 1981 to 2010. And they said, okay, what if we shift our time frame and say, whoa, from 1991 to 2020? Are those values roughly the same? They should be. Well, they aren't. What it turned out is that when you look at the above average, below average months, you end up with a lot of months in the 30-year period. This says how many months in that 30-year period from 2020 to 1990 were warmer than months from 2000 to from 2020 to 1991 versus 2010 to 1981. So if you shift by 10 years, and it turned out, well, there could be as many as 80 months in that 30-year period that were warmer than the previous 30-year period. And look at where they are. Oh my goodness, it's California. Now, it's not as bad as some of the other states, but we had a lot of warm months. And notice also that it's not quite as clear cut on the eastern side of the US. So things really are warmer. That's the first lesson. The second question is, okay, but are they drier? It depends on where you are. If you are east of the Mississippi, then no, it's actually been a little bit wetter than before. Again, you're comparing the 30-year period, 1991 to 2020 to 1981 to 2010. But if you're in the Western US, yes, they have been drier, and here's your difference in inches of water. What's really interesting, I don't want to belabor this point, you can stare at these graphs at your own leisure, but look at some of our fall situations. I don't know about San Diego specifically, but I know in sort of central and northern California, our fall rains have tended to come later and later and later. And look at November. That's spectacular. You know how we end up with those massive fires in mid-November? Yeah, it's because we haven't had any rain. So we are warmer and we are drier. How do you communicate this to your clients? Well, we can use these graphs. Feel free to use this however you wish. But also have a look at the National Weather Service website, because it is super cool, and you can instantly pull it up on your phone when you're talking to a client, an angry civilian, or an uninformed policymaker. And what you can see, so you'll go to your local San Diego office, you'll scroll down, and there's this little thing here that says recent temperatures. You click on that, and you pull up what's called the calendar year chart, which is right here, calendar year chart. And you get two things. You've got the temperatures up top, and then you have the cumulative rainfall at the bottom. It's cumulative, right? You're accumulating over a period of a year. So you start with nothing in January, you set it at 0, and then it starts raining, and you accumulate, you end up with something, somewhere around 10 inches, right? Rainfall in December. And so this light green is the normal. That's a smooth curve here. That's the normal. The fluorescent green, that's the actual amount. And if the actual amount, you see how it's jagged, because this is an individual storm, that's an individual storm, that's an individual storm, here's an individual storm. If this line is below the normal, then you have a deficit. Right? If the line is actually above the normal, then you have a wet hue. So let me show you what this looks like. Here's Riverside. In these 9 years, how many years in Riverside were above long-term average? It's not a trick question. Can you see it? How many years here were above the long-term average? Well, basically just 2019. Right? How many years were severely below long-term average? Well, this 1, 2, 3, at least 4. But basically all of them were below average. So things really are drier, at least in the last decade. I couldn't fit any more of these graphs. But do you see how this works? How about San Diego? You want to make any guesses for San Diego? How many years between 2013 and 2021 for San Diego are above average? Well, 2019. 2015, you came very close to the average. Very, very close. And then 2017 started off really well, but then there was nothing in the fall. I find these graphs really, really illuminating because you don't have to argue with somebody about stuff. You can just look at them and say, look, this is how much water we have had. So if you're trying to decide whether to apply water, this I think is very, very useful. And so you can see actually for 2020, you guys were below long-term average. We in Northern California were very far below, but you guys, even you were a little bit below. Okay. So I promised I would talk about heat, and I'll try to wrap it up with heat. I mentioned that heat makes things worse in a few different ways. It increases demand for water, it reduces the availability of water, and then ultimately it damages the tissues if it's really hot. What happened to us in Northern California that we ended up with a number of record-breaking hot days late in the year. So starting sort of in July and moving on to July, August, September, October, all the way into November. And the way you know it's record-breaking is that the actual temperature, which is this blue, hits a peak. And this red are the temperature peaks. And you can see where we've blown through the previous record. How about San Diego? Did you have any really warm days last year? Oh, yeah, you have. I know that because I checked your graph. So this is your graph. And you can again see, look at this, December, you broke a December temperature record. So think what that means for water use, right? At a time when the plant should be recovering from that summer stress, should be taking up water, should be beginning to rebuild its photosynthetic tissues. It gets hit with extreme heat. I think this is another useful thing to keep an eye on, where you have these unusual heat spikes or where you have unusually long heat spikes. I don't think you've had those in San Diego necessarily last year. I see one. This seems to be a set of multiple days, sometime in late September when it was super hot. But in Northern California, we had whole stretches when it was really hot. And again, think of what that means for a plant that's trying to recover from drought. The next resource I think is useful is this question of, well, how droughty is it? This is a useful thing to look at. This is the reservoir conditions from CDEC, and CDEC is the California Data Exchange Center from the Department of Water Resources. And when it looks like this, it is time to be concerned because the biggest reservoirs, which are Trinity, Shasta, and Oroville, are all quite low. You'll see actually some of the Southern California reservoirs are not doing as poorly, but they're also much smaller. So what you're really looking at are kind of these three up here. And they are low. They're much lower. You have a sort of historical average in red, and you can see where we are today. What proportion of the historical average on this day? I pulled this up yesterday. So it's from Monday? So the data is from Monday, and you can see that we're like, 1/3 of where we should be. Not great. And again, you want to know this because this may influence what happens in the coming months. It's not going to influence what happens tomorrow, probably, but it may influence what happens in the coming months. And this is because your water in San Diego comes from, over half of it comes from the Colorado River aqueduct, but at least 20%, and some years more, this varies, by the way, from year to year, comes from the State Water Project, SWP, which is this brown line here, the California aqueduct that goes all the way to the Delta. Now, of course, for those of us in Northern California, we just don't even look at anything below here, because why would we? But the thing is, the system is interconnected. And so I'll go back. What happens in these giant reservoirs actually does have a bearing on what will happen to you again some months from now. So just kind of keep this in mind. The exciting part, good news, or however you want to sort of phrase this, is this local part. Going back about 10 years, California has made a decision to really emphasize local water supplies. And so what would that mean? Well, the first thing I think to do is to recognize the value of water for urban trees. And this is my favorite quote from Jay Lund, who's a professor at UC Davis, who said that, why was there so little economic impact from that 2012 to 2016 drought? And he says, well, yeah, no, urban water just doesn't matter all that much economically, because look at that. When our water supply was cut to 25%, there was little economic impact. Maybe there are some urban trees lost. Well, this is a problem. This kind of attitude really devalues all of those services that urban trees provide. So I think it's useful I'm not suggesting that you go out and say, give us more water from Lake Oroville, but I am saying that we need to make a better case for the value of urban trees and the value of water that's used to support those urban trees. I think that's step one. Step two, and the problem that we had here is that we did have quite a bit of wasted water, not so long ago. And then we went from that to no water at all. And I think that's the problem. The problem is we just went to nothing. Second thing is to take care of the trees. And again, we're planning for a different climate. What used to work well may not. So it's just a matter of change the plant palette, but also to do what we can with the planting sites. And then to plan for the new water sources. If we're providing water, we're doing that in the context of sustainability. We have irrigation systems that are not busted. I think that's step one. It looks really bad. Whatever you do, repair the irrigation system, because nothing looks as bad as a malfunctioning irrigation system. And I'm not going to go through all of these points, but I think it's worth keeping those large trees alive because they really are a good example of what's possible. And they serve as kind of your advocates in the broader discussion of whether we should maintain trees or not. It's hard for people to envision what a park or a streetscape could look like with giant trees. But if you have giant trees already, then it's really worth trying to preserve them because you don't have to envision anything. You can just take people outside and say, this is what we're trying to preserve. And then again, step three would be to really take care of that conversation about water and point out to people that trees are adapted to drought. We may need to help them get through, but there's a difference between helping and not doing anything. New sources of water, again, I'm not going to go through this very much. There is this issue of gray water. I think the main problem is that there's just not very much of it, and it comes in small amounts as the water comes out of your washing machine. I'd like to see a lot more investment in this because I think we could really use this for much of the rest of our landscapes. But as it stands now, nobody seems all that interested. The second thing is the purple pipe or recycled water. And those are totally different things, right? Purple pipe is water that's wastewater that's been treated and then distributed. Big potential. Also potential policy difficulties because the people who make recycled water would prefer to clean it to drinking water standards and then sell it to you as potable water, which actually is fine, but it might not work in those years when there is a lot of water to go around. Whereas we, landscape side, we could really use the purple pipe water pretty much all the time. And there's a wonderful guide that's just been published on how to use recycled water in landscapes. And it's available from is it PASMA? I will find the link and I will send it to Vince, but it's an excellent, very short, very thorough guide on what to look for when you're trying to use recycled water in landscapes. And then the final thing is to really try to reframe this conversation. We have multiple sources of water, and potable water is probably going to be our backup in the future rather than our first choice for irrigation. But we do have these other water sources that we need to develop. And the final thing really is to change the conversation around stewardship. It's not the city's trees, it's our trees. And we would like to keep them, we'd like to have them again in that context of sustainability. And that's it. I'm just going to put up the slides that I had before. Trees need water, not a lot, but they need some. They can recover from droughts. We can help it or we can not help it. And then think about how we talk about water. Think about how we talk about droughts, because we are going to have more droughts. We're going to have more hot droughts. And this is a conversation we need to keep having. So that's it. I think we have a couple of minutes, right, for questions. We go until 12.
Yeah, we got a couple questions in the chat already, and if anybody wants to.
All right, read them to me.
Absolutely. First one, actually 2 questions. And it sounds like you're fine sharing out copies of the slide deck.
Yeah.
Okay. You sent it to me. I'll get it online and get people a link that they can view it at. Next question is, could the VPD relationship between heat and humidity be related to summer limb drop phenomenon in certain species such as eucalyptus?
Maybe. Unfortunately, there's very little research, that's actual research that's been done on summer limb drop. But yes, it has been speculated that this is in fact what happened, that it's somehow connected with water transport. Not that there isn't enough water necessarily, but that something gets messed up. At the same time, I'm kind of having trouble seeing it, because water transport occurs in most trees, including eucalyptus, in a very thin band of tissue. So why is the rest of the branch failing? Now, the flip side to that is that the band of tissue in which water is transported is on the outside of the tree. That is the most critical part of the tissue for structure. So yeah, it is conceivable that if you suddenly lose all structural strength in this outer band of tissue, what's happening in here is actually less important. You've now compromised the point of failure. But ultimately, I don't know. So.
All right. Appreciate that. Is it possible a tree may choose to use energy reserves that are dedicated to fruit and flowers instead of using reserves to create foliage synthesis?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And the answer is yes. A tree can redirect its remaining energy reserves to producing seeds. And that is very commonly seen in conifers. That's what they call a stress crop. When you have trees that are stressed for some reason, typically either drought or an insect, and they'll produce a massive crop of cones because they're basically saying, I don't think I'm going to make it, but I do want to preserve my genes. So here we go. Yes, it is possible. Mm-hmm.
All right. Next one is, thank you for the superb information. Do you know of any research that has been done on root recession during drought?
Yes, there has been some research done on root recession. There's more of a conceptual view rather than actual numbers, but what is pretty clear happens very quickly is the fine roots die. Now, fine roots die all the time. Fine roots have a lifespan that's measured in days or weeks, and most people don't quite realize that. So fine roots turn over, meaning they die, new ones grow, die, new ones grow, all the time. That's the first thing that goes when a tree is drought stressed. So, and again, one other reason why it takes some time for trees to recover, they now need to push out a new crop of really fine roots to be able to absorb that water. So yes, if you look for Kim Coder, C-O-D-E-R, he has some leaflets that he's written about that. It's University of Georgia, and I think there might be references in those. But the other person to ask would be Astrid Volder, V as in Victor, O-L-D as in dog, E-R, Astrid Volder at UC Davis. She does a lot of root research. She might have a better sense for how quickly those roots die. But yeah, first thing that happens really.
All right. Couple more. Client said she was told to only choose a broadleaf tree for carbon sequestration. Do you see certain trees being more ideal for low water use and other ecological services?
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. Carbon sequestration is just one of tree benefits. And unless you're doing something really weird in urban areas, I don't think the way to think about this is to go, I want a tree that sequesters the most carbon, because that tree might not be all that desirable in other ways, right? We could plant, I don't know what, bamboo or something. That's not necessarily the way to think about it. But the way carbon sequestration works is actually pretty simple. Tree takes up CO2 from the air, that's the sequestration part, takes up water, runs the photosynthetic machine, and then makes stable carbon compounds like cellulose and lignin, which turn into wood. So you have to have water. There is no carbon sequestration without water. I've never seen this thing about choosing only broadleaf. You may choose broadleaf species because, for example, it meets your site requirements, or you want shade, or you want trees that drop leaves in winter because you want sun in winter, whatever other reason. But no, I don't think you would just generically say broadleaf trees somehow are better. There's a number of conifers that grow really quickly. And so by definition, they would sequester carbon. They might be totally unsuitable for what you're trying to do. So the way I would think about this, I would think of carbon sequestration in context of all of the other urban tree functions and urban tree benefits. And I would not worry about, I know some people have published these lists of this tree sequesters this much carbon, that tree sequesters so much less carbon. So, tree A is better than tree B. If tree A doesn't grow in your area or doesn't meet your other goals, then it doesn't matter. So I would not focus on carbon sequestration to the exclusion of everything else, basically.
All right, and a bit of a related question, and I think you may have a whole other presentation on this, is there a tree palette that is truly adapted to our new climate? There's so many so-called drought-tolerant plant lists that still need plenty of irrigation. Looking for what grows really with zero irrigation after establishment. Toyon, Chinese mesquite, sugar bush, those sorts of things. And this is for North County, San Diego inland.
Right. So it depends, right? It depends on where you are, but it also depends on what you're trying to do. If you truly have zero irrigation, then yeah, you're going to be restricted to some of the kind of semi-desert plants that may or may not be trees. I think that another way of thinking about this is there water you could apply? And I know we went through those new sources of water pretty quickly, but I think that's one of those questions that we should start asking. Is there recycled water? Is there gray water? Is there storm water or rainwater that we could capture and then apply to the landscape? Because it may be worth it. Maybe worth it for the benefits that a tree would provide in a place that otherwise might not grow trees without any supplemental water. I think this is really the big question kind of for the next 20 years. What do we want our landscapes to look like? In some places, it'll be exactly as you described. It'll be only those plants that can survive with no irrigation once established. We have a study that kind of shows how this works for some of the really common urban trees. But ultimately, once you move into places that really are desert, and there are not that many of them in California, but there are some, I think the question will be more of what water can you provide, how much, how reliably, rather than are we really going to restrict our palette to sort of Joshua trees and mesquite?
All right. Oh boy, one more. I'm going to butcher this, but can you explain the relationship between drought stress and incidence of Batriospharia cankers?
Yeah, so Batriospharia are sort of not terribly aggressive pathogens, most of them, which means that they prefer trees that are drought stressed. And so Batriospharia frequently starts out as an endophyte, meaning it's living inside a tree part somewhere, inside a branch or branch stub, for example, and is not really able to spread very well. Then once the tree is stressed, once the tree becomes drought stressed, the fungus takes advantage of that. And sometimes it's kind of a mechanical thing. When a tree loses enough moisture on the inside and ends up with air, a lot of our wood decay organisms, that's when they strike, because they're able to then actually grow, whereas they weren't able to grow before. Batriospharia is probably a little more complicated in that it is really a pathogen, so it's able to kill cells, but it's certainly able to do that much better when a tree is water stressed. And so if you have trees that are water stressed, that have parts infected with Batriospharia, the sort of old school recommendation was to try to remove those parts. And I think that's sort of reasonable, because again, it'll use whatever dead parts of the tree there are at the moment to then spread into the rest of the tree. But I will say that we would welcome a lot more research on how to actually manage Batriospharia. It's not there is a bit of a dearth of research on that.
All right. Well, we got some of the right people in place there. Definitely, if we can get the funding. Yeah, it looks like that's it for the questions. Igor, thank you as always. It was very engaging. Great presentation, throwing a lot of information at us, even at a compressed amount of time, and ended up pretty much right on time. So appreciate it. And so what we'll do at this point, I'm going to stop the recording.